The main topics that I spoke about today in connection with this award were about changes in the Arctic, primarily changes in vegetation productivity and energy balance, also about changes in fire disturbance and the intensity of fire disturbance, and then about permafrost, changes in permafrost. And then finally I talk about how we can influence policy in each of those scientific research areas. We're seeing very interesting changes in vegetation productivity in the Arctic, and they're really quite contrasting between what's happening in the Arctic, meaning tundra vegetation and tundra ecosystems, compared to what's happening in the boreal forest, the northern forests of Alaska, Canada, and Russia. In the tundra areas, we see increases in productivity of vegetation over the past 30 years. Almost everywhere we look, we see these systematic increases in vegetation productivity. In contrast, in the boreal forest, we see declines in productivity in many areas, and we've seen that that is tightly coupled with temperature increases and dry air masses that reduce productivity. Finally, we look at the impacts of changing vegetation, what we expect to happen in the future based on what we're observing currently with satellite and field observations. And what we see is that the primary driver of change in the Arctic that's likely to take place over the next 40, 50 years is the reflectivity of the surface and the energy balance components. And those are really the big drivers. They will far outweigh the amount of carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere by vegetation productivity and biomass accumulation. The fire disturbance in the Arctic is very important. And again, there's a real distinction between what's happening in Arctic tundra ecosystems versus what's happening in the boreal forest. In the latter, in boreal forest, fire has been historically always part of the system. In fact, the trees, some types of trees require fire to release the seeds that create the succession that occurs after burning. But much of what we're seeing in those areas of the boreal forest is a much intensified fire regime, more severe fires, bigger fires, and that's very important because these fires are not only burning the trees, but they're burning the organic soil, the peatland soils. And when the soils burn off, it completely changes everything that happens afterwards in terms of vegetation succession, energy balance. Everything about the system is changed, and it persists for decades. Permafrost is a really critical topic in Arctic systems. We've known for a long time that permafrost is important. It has the potential to release a tremendous amount of carbon to the atmosphere. So permafrost are these areas that have been frozen and locked up carbon that's for thousands or tens of thousands of years now. But the potential for permafrost thaw associated with climate warming, but especially with the increased fire severity that we're seeing, is for a tremendous amount of carbon to be released faster than we initially thought could happen. Because when fire burns off the insulating layer that protects permafrost and keeps it frozen, when that is removed, then the permafrost is exposed to the warmer temperature of the atmosphere, and you see a big pulse of carbon come out. So the potential for that to change climate is enormous just because there's so much carbon stored in these systems. I think there are two ways to influence policy about changes in the Arctic, and especially about the permafrost issue of permafrost thaw. One is science policy, and the Woods Hole Research Center is very engaged in science policy and influencing what information gets into the IPCC working group reports, and for example in the 5th assessment report. But there's also the policy by policy makers, and we try to work with a number of different groups there through the State Department of the United States, the Arctic Council, which the United States now chairs, through the Arctic Circle, which is a broader consortium of nations with interests in the Arctic. And for there, it's really a matter of educating policymakers on what the potential of permafrost thaw is, because to date, it hasn't been considered. And the emissions that could be released from permafrost thaw are comparable to another United States, the emissions on an annual basis of a country as big as the United States, the second largest emitter in the world.